Well, good morning. Great to see you this morning. One of the things that I wanted to start off by doing today is we had an event yesterday that was a kids park Halloween party, and we just wanted to get them together in their costumes and play some games, and also to have some of our adults help out, and even some of our seniors helping out with the games. And so I actually brought some pictures with me to start today. I figured starting out with cute kids in costumes is never a bad way to start a sermon. The ping pong ball squirt gun game was pretty popular there. Some good ones there, yeah. And it wasn't just ping pong balls that were being squirted as well. Painting some pumpkins. Yeah, so it was really a great time, and that's not the only thing we're doing for Halloween. We're going to do our regular Halloween outreach as well, setting up a table, handing out candy to kids out on the corner here at Johnson Street, and that's always a great time. I thought you might enjoy seeing some of those pictures. So anyway, all right, on with the message. I think probably most of you know I've worn glasses pretty much all my life, and I don't remember how old I was the first time I got glasses. I was talking with my mom the other day, and it's kind of a hereditary thing. My mom has worn them for a long time. My two sisters have. My brother managed to avoid it for many, many years. Even he wears glasses now too. But I was talking with my mom, and I said, something about me wearing them since kindergarten, and she said, no, you haven't been wearing them since kindergarten, that's your sister. And I was like, well, I don't usually get myself and my sister mixed up, but okay, maybe you're right about that. In any case, I've been wearing them as long as I can remember. I can't remember a time when I didn't have to wear glasses. I remember a time where I didn't want to wear glasses, and I should have been wearing glasses, and I didn't, and it made for some kind of embarrassing situations, but I've always worn glasses as long as I can remember. And over the years, my glasses have gotten stronger and stronger and stronger, and that for me has been kind of a disappointment. Maybe one of the things that I'm most self-conscious about is wearing my glasses. When I preach on Sunday mornings, I usually wear contacts, and then I wear some readers too, because my eyes are so bad that they don't have contacts that are strong enough, really, for me to have a full prescription or to be able to read properly. But when I was in seminary, I had a seminary professor who told me. And at that time, they didn't have contacts strong enough for my eyes. But he told me, your glasses are going to be a barrier to your preaching. And so try to figure that out. And of course, that didn't help with the self-consciousness and all of that. Well, anyway, all that to say, actually, in a couple of weeks, I'm going to get my eyes fixed. And I know that there are probably some of you who have done that before, have had LASIK surgery in that. Well, I'm not even a good candidate for LASIK surgery. And so they have to do a different sort of thing where they actually replace the lens in my eye with a prescription lens. It's essentially cataract surgery. And they're going to do it. They'll do my left eye, I think November 11th, I think is the date. And then 2 weeks later, they're going to do my right eye, which is going to make for 2 weeks of awkwardness. Like I'm going to have to wear like one lens in my glasses and take the other one out or something. I'll wear one contact lens. Stephen Kindy thinks I should preach in a monocle. And if I do that, then I need a top hat and probably a cane and some tails and all that too. So who knows? We might have some really interesting sermons over the course of those weeks. But it's actually something that I'm really looking forward to, and something that in many ways will change my life and will make my life much, much better. One of the things that I'm most looking forward to is being able to read a paper Bible again. Because right now, the print in them are so small that I've had to just pretty much strictly go to digital, so I can control the font size. And but it's going to be really nice to be able to get a Bible and to be able to read it that way. Well, here's the reason I'm telling you all this. Is because we are going to be talking about sight. We're going to be talking about vision. And of course, we're not going to be talking primarily about physical vision. We're going to be talking about spiritual vision. And the story that we're going to be looking at today is one where Jesus fixes a man's eyes. In fact, it gives him a new lens through which to see the world. It's different than anything he'd seen before. And even everyone else who was around there, it's giving them a new lens to be able to see the world as well. And Jesus was really good at that. He was really good not just at giving people physical sight, but also giving them spiritual sight. And so over the next few messages, I guess we can call it a series. But basically what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at encounters that different types of people have with Jesus. Sinners, religious people, victims, children. We're going to be looking at all of those things. And the point of it is for us to be able to see Jesus, but then also to be able to learn to look at life through the lens of Jesus, to be able to see people the way Jesus sees them. And so there's a reason why we chose the story that we did today, because it's talking specifically about spiritual sight. And it's one that invites us to ask this key question, and that is, how is your vision? Okay? See, many of us are blinded by our preconceived notions of who God is. Or we're blinded by what we want God to be, or what we've been taught growing up. And so what we want to do is we want to go right back to the source of where we see Jesus. And we want to look at Jesus with fresh eyes again, and try to see what we can learn from these encounters that people have with Jesus. And so in order to do that, I want you to turn with me to John chapter 9. And all of you, I would like you to turn there. And let's make sure the lights are up high enough for people to be able to read their paper Bibles, because we're going to be walking right through this passage, and we're going to be looking at it quite a bit. So make sure you're able to see it. If you need to pull open a pew Bible, I think it's on page 734. And we'll be going through that whole story. Now, as you're turning there, let me give you a little bit of background to this story here that's really helpful, and then we'll go ahead and read all the way through, and then we'll walk our way through it. So, one of the main themes that runs through the Gospel of John, and if you ever sit down and read through it all at one time, this will be really clear, is this theme of light versus darkness, of being able to see versus not seeing. And so, for instance, at the beginning of the book of John, when he is introducing Jesus, this is how he introduces him in John 1:3. He says, "In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not understood it." And then the book is littered with stories of light and darkness. So if you ever read it, just go ahead and look for those themes, littered with stories of Jesus bringing light to the darkness, people who are in the dark. And typically what happens is, whether or not they are able to see, whether they are able to see who he really is determined by their willingness to open their eyes. Now, the story today is a story that is absolutely brilliantly crafted. I know there are a lot of people who don't think about the Bible as being a brilliantly crafted story, but you're going to see some things that John does in this story here that just will make it come alive, okay? Now, the story starts with Jesus walking in Jerusalem. He's walking with his disciples, and they see a blind man who is begging by the side of the road. And this was a common thing in Jesus' day. Today, we have great medicine. We have great preventative things that allow people to be able to see. You know, we can do surgery where you replace the lens in people's eyes. But even among children, you know, we have these very simple things that we can do that prevent diseases from coming on that used to be very common. But in those days, like I said, the eye diseases were common, and so blindness was actually pretty prevalent at the time. And so John tells us that this man that they come across was blind from birth. Now, rabbis of that day believed that there was a one-to-one relationship between sin and sickness. So in other words, disability or chronic sickness was always the direct result of someone else's sin. And so if you were sick, if you had a disability, it was because you had brought it upon yourself. Okay, so there's the background of the story. So let's go ahead and turn to the passage, John chapter 9, and we're just going to read the whole chapter. So follow along with me. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" You see what they're doing there. "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus, "but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the pool of Siloam." This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "No, I'm the man." "How then were your eyes opened?" they asked. He replied, "The man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes, and he told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see." "Where is this man?" they asked him. "I don't know," he said. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now, the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore, the Pharisees also asked him how he received his sight. "He put mud on my eyes," the man replied, and I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others asked, "How can a sinner perform such signs?" So they were divided. Then they turned again to the blind man. "What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened." The man replied, "He is a prophet." They still did not believe that he had been blind and that he received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. "Is this your son?" they asked. "Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see?" "We know he is our son," the parents answered, "and we know he was born blind. But how he can see now and who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He's of age. He'll speak for himself." The parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders, who already decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That was why his parents said, "He is of age. Ask him." A second time they summoned the man who had been blind. "Give glory to God by telling the truth," they said. "We know this man is a sinner." He replied, "Whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see." Then they asked him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered, "I have already told you, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" Then they hurled insults at him and said, "You're this fellow's disciple. We're disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from." The man answered, "Now this is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to a godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." To this they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me so that I may believe in him." Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking to you." The man said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshiped him. Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into the world so that the blind will see and those who see will become blind." Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this, asked, "What, are we blind too?" Jesus said, "If you were blind, you'd not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim to see, your guilt remains." So, the Pharisees believed and taught that if you are sick, that you brought this disability upon yourself. Now, you can imagine how this would impact a society. If sickness was caused by sin, then anyone who was sick, disabled, or blind was just getting what they deserved. And so not only were people sick or disabled, they were pushed to the margins of society because they weren't obviously very good people. And so people who weren't healthy had only themselves to blame, and the religious people had explicit permission to blame them for their sin and for their sickness. And even when they were required to give alms because of the law, regular people would oftentimes have very little compassion for people like this. And of course, this is the system that prompted the disciples to ask the question, like we saw in verse 2, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind. And they didn't really mean anything by the question. They actually were just sort of parroting the beliefs of their society. They were products of their society. But one of the things that we learn about Jesus is Jesus was not a product of his society. In fact, he didn't see people the same way everyone else did. First of all, he didn't blame the man for his sin. And in fact, he didn't even blame his parents for his sins. He answered this way. He said, this isn't because of his sin or his parents' sin. Okay? But not only did he not blame the man, he actually did something that many other people at the time would not. He had compassion on them. Now, in this particular case, it doesn't say that he had compassion on him, but we know that he did. Why do we know that? Because he healed him. Okay, he decided that he was going to fix the situation. Rather than have the man be a sideshow and a topic of conversation, he looked at him and he realized that he is more than just someone who is sitting beside the side of the road, more than just a topic of conversation. And so Jesus then does something that I think we can all agree is pretty gross. In fact, I'm not sure why Jesus did it this way, and commentators have a few explanations for it. I'm not sure which one is right, because there are a lot of different ones. But what he did was he spit in the mud, or spit in the dirt, and then he made some mud, which, when you think about it, that's probably a lot of spit, too. So he makes this mud, and then he rubs it on the guy's eyes. Which, again, it seems like kind of a strange thing to do, but I suppose if you've been blind from birth and there's a possibility that you're going to be healed, you're going to do just about anything that you can to make it happen. And so he rubs it on the guy's eyes, and he tells him, go wash in the pool of Siloam. And so he does that, and it says in verse 7, the man went and washed and came home seeing. That's it. He went and he washed and he came home seeing. He didn't go back to Jesus. Jesus doesn't show up at the pool. The guy is healed, or Jesus leaves. The guy goes, he can see, and then he goes home. I mean, it just seems like really kind of an anticlimactic story when you think about it. You would think that there would be some sort of big revelation that goes on there, but no, he goes, washes in the pool, then he goes home. Oh, and by the way, he can see. Kind of a strange thing. But when he goes home, the people around him, his neighbors, the people who have probably seen him for all of his life, start to do double takes. Start looking at him like, hey, wait a minute, isn't that the guy that used to be blind? He used to sit at the gate begging all the time, and there are others that are going, well, no, that's not really, that can't be him. He was blind, and nobody blind from birth gets healed, and so it's got to be just another guy that looks like him. And so they're having this debate, and they're not sure what happened. And the reason they're doing this is because even though they saw him probably every day, probably for their whole life, they never really paid that much attention to him. I mean, he was just a part of the scenery. He was just another one of the masses of people who had been begging by the gate day after day, and they'd never thought about the fact that he wasn't just a blind guy. I mean, he had a story. He had a family. He had emotions. At least, at one point in his life, I'm sure he had dreams of doing this or that or something bigger. Maybe he even had dreams of something seeing. And so when something remarkable happened, the people who were around him really couldn't even see it. They really didn't even notice what happened because they had never paid enough attention to this guy to really care about him. But that's the thing about spiritual vision, is that you don't really see until you actually look. And Jesus had a habit of looking. Now, of course, we might initially be disgusted by the neighbors and think something like, well, how could they be so callous that they couldn't see all of those people who were in need? But how often do we do the same thing with people in our path? How often do we allow people, whether in the church, at your work, at school, alongside the road, how often do we allow them and their hurts and struggles to blend into the scenery, and we don't really even give it a second thought? Well, you get the point there. As the neighbors are having the conversation among themselves, then the man chimes in at the end of verse 9, and he says, they're talking amongst themselves, and he's right there, and he's like, hey, everyone, I'm right here. You can talk to me, right? That's me. I'm the guy. And so the neighbors who had never really talked to him before, now they're curious about him. And they start to ask him, they say, well, if that's you, then how in the world can you see? How in the world can you see? I mean, did you get some new glasses? Did you get surgery, eye surgery, something like that? Verse 11, he says this, the man they called Jesus made some mud, put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash, so I went and washed, and then I could see. Pretty consistent story, pretty simple story there. That's his testimony. And now what I want you to see here is I want you to see the progression of the man, not the physical sight that he's getting, but the spiritual sight that he's getting. Okay? First of all, he'd never met Jesus. Okay? So he doesn't know who he is. And keep in mind, he was blind when he met Jesus, and he never saw him after that. Right? So he was blind. He'd never met Jesus. But after that, Jesus heals him. Then he knows his name. This man they called Jesus healed me. Right? So you start to see that progression. Now keep an eye on that because we'll see more. Okay? So then the neighbors asked, okay, so where is this guy now? And of course he was like, well, I don't know. He just left, I guess, just disappeared. Okay? And now the people are intrigued because they want to get some answers. This is not something that happens every day. And so they got to get some answers. And so when you get, and they realize at this point that there's probably something spiritual going on here. And so where do you go when you need spiritual answers? Well, you go to the spiritual experts. And so he takes them, they take them to the Pharisees. They were the experts. Now, the Pharisees were a group of religious leaders in Jesus' day. If you were a good Jewish person, you would for sure go to them to ask them about any questions that you had about the Jewish law. So, for instance, they were kind of like Google for the law. So they would go and say something like, "Hey Google, how do blind people get healed?" And so then you'd talk to them, and they would try to give you some answers. Now, oftentimes the Pharisees get a bad rap. They usually end up being Jesus' foil in all of the stories. He usually ends up against them somehow. But not all of them were bad. In a couple weeks, in fact, we'll look at the story of a good Pharisee named Nicodemus, who was open to Jesus and open to the gospel. But in the Gospels, Jesus usually ends up being against the Pharisees, and that's what happens in this case as well. And the issue between them was always how the Pharisees handled the Jewish law. I mean, there are a lot of things that Jesus and the Pharisees would have agreed about, but how they handled the Jewish law and how they treated people in response was usually the point of difference between them. But not only did they know the law, they were experts at keeping the law, and they were experts at making sure everyone else kept the law as well. And they did this by doing something called building a hedge around the law. And basically what that means is that they would take a particular law and they would stack more laws on top of it to make sure that you couldn't get close enough to that law to actually break it. So for instance, if there's a law about not working on the Sabbath, then they would parse out everything that could possibly be work. Okay, if I lift my pinky finger, is that work? No, I don't think so. If you lift your index finger, is that work? Yeah, maybe. If you lift your middle finger, well, no, that's something else, so you need to stay away from that too. But what they would do is they would parse out all of these things and just to make sure that people were not able to break the law. But what it did, and Jesus' problem with this, is it created this unbelievable burden on people's shoulders that their whole spiritual life was about following all of the rules and making sure that everything was in the proper order. And they were so adamant about this that oftentimes they would just forget about the humanity of the people themselves. Well, they were oftentimes not very popular with Jesus, but they were pretty popular with the people, pretty well respected among the people at the time. And so that's why they went to the Pharisees with religious questions. And so then we see in verse 14, John adds this little detail that he had left out before this point. The day on which Jesus made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a, what? Sabbath. All right. Now, why does he share this bit of information? Well, Sabbath was one of the important laws for them. This was something that really mattered to the Pharisees. And so when the neighbors told them what happened, rather than immediately saying, "What? You got to be kidding me. A man born blind was healed? I mean, come on, this is amazing. Let's get the guy and let's celebrate together." Right? Instead of doing that, what did they do? They're like, well, let's see. It was done on the Sabbath, so there's something not quite right about this. We need to look into this. Okay? This was the attitude that they had. Their rule-breaking antennas went up, and they started to investigate, started to ask some questions of people. Okay? Verse 15. The Pharisees asked him how he had received his sight. And, his story has been the same the whole time. He put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and now I see. Okay? So there's just that one fact in there. Well, actually, there are two facts there. One, Jesus healed him. Number two, it was on the Sabbath. Now, commentators tell us that when Jesus healed the man, he actually broke the Pharisees' Sabbath law in three different ways. The first one was that the situation wasn't life or death. In other words, if the man were having a heart attack and Jesus wanted to do CPR, that was going to be okay. But if he's just blind, then he should have waited until the next day to heal him. All right, so that was one of them. The second one was he made mud, and making mud required some kneading and all of that, and so that was something that was prohibited on the Sabbath, and so he broke that law as well. And finally, there was an actual law against putting salve on someone's eyes on the Sabbath. And so he broke three laws there, and so they were pretty up in arms about this. And so those facts are all that the Pharisees needed in order to make up their mind. So in verse 16 it says, some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." Now, there were others that at least initially were more open. Okay, and they would ask this question: how could a common sinner perform signs like this? But for the most part, because of their stringent adherence to the interpretation of their interpretation of the law, it blinded them to the fact that we have a man here who was born blind who had just been miraculously healed. And their blind adherence to the law didn't allow them to celebrate that fact. In fact, they just pressed the man further. They said, "All right, so we know what you say happened to you, but what is your opinion about this man that healed you?" Okay, now, on the surface, this is an innocent question, right? But, of course, when you know the history, when you know the story, you know that this is actually a loaded question, don't you? I mean, there are some questions that people ask, but they're trying to get a particular answer out of it, and you have to be really careful with how you answer those questions at the time. And we have some questions like this. Probably the most famous one is, does this dress make me look fat? Okay. Got to be careful how you answer that question, right? The answer is always no, okay? Or how about one from your significant other? Do you think she's attractive? Loaded question, right? You can, I mean, if you're into people who are perfectly toned and have smooth skin and well-defined features, but I'm really not. I'm really more into you, so not a good answer, all right? Or how about, if I die, will you marry again? Well, of course, I can't wait, right? You just have to be careful. You just have to be careful how you answer questions like that, because there are some questions that people ask that they really don't want the answer to, or they want a particular answer to it. And that was this question, all right? They had a loaded question, but the great thing about the guy's answer is he didn't care what answer they were looking for, because there is a certain freedom that happens when you have been blind from birth and you've been healed that pretty much everything else pales in comparison. You just really don't care. And so they ask him, what do you think about this guy? And so he takes it a little bit further, and he says, well, I think he must be some kind of a prophet. Of course, for the Pharisees, this was the wrong answer. But they were so blinded by what they wanted to see from Jesus that they weren't able to see. And in fact, they started to doubt whether there was actually a miracle there. They started to question, all right, I don't think this guy is really blind. He kind of wandered onto the scene and he just wants to get attention or something like that. And so what do? They call for his parents. So his parents enter the scene. Verse 19, is this the one you say, or actually maybe it would be better stated, is this the one you claim was born blind? Well, if that's the case, then how is it that now he can see? Now, parents were certainly happy that their son was healed. I mean, can you imagine if your child has a disability or something like that, and finally they're healed and they're whole again and all of that? Imagine the amount of joy that you would have as a parent there, okay? But they didn't have the same kind of freedom that he did. In fact, this was their answer. It said, yes, he's our son, and he was blind from birth, but we weren't there when it happened, and so we don't really know who healed him. Sorry, you're just going to have to ask him. So they sort of distanced himself, even though I really believe they knew the answer to the question. But then John tells us why they answered the way they did. He adds this editorial explanation. It says they were afraid to answer because the Jewish leaders had announced that anyone who had said Jesus is the Messiah would be expelled from the synagogue. See, the interpretation that the Pharisees wanted put pressure on the man, put pressure on his parents, and it made it impossible for them to be able to admit the truth. At least if they wanted to continue to be a part of the synagogue, if they wanted to continue to have their support system and their network of people, they had to sort of deny the truth or deny what they actually felt. They knew what happened, but the Pharisees kept them in darkness by their own blind opposition to Jesus. Now, what is so amazing about the Pharisees' opposition to Jesus is that people receiving sight is one of the explicit signs of the coming of the Messiah. I mean, it is right there in just about any passage that talks about the coming of the Messiah, you see it. For instance, Isaiah chapter 29, starting with verse 18, talking about the day that the Messiah comes. In that day, the deaf will hear the words of the scroll, and out of gloom and darkness, the eyes of the blind will see. Same thing a little bit later in Isaiah chapter 42. And here he's talking to the Messiah. This is sort of the call or the anointing of the Messiah. He says, I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and make you to be a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles, to open the eyes that are blind, to free captives from prison and release from dungeon those who sit in darkness. And that's the claim that when Jesus came on the scene in Luke chapter 4, he goes into the synagogue and he opens the scroll of Isaiah and he reads this part. He says, the Spirit of the Lord is on me because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And even when John the Baptist was starting to have doubts, he was in jail and was starting to have doubts about whether Jesus was actually the Messiah, actually the one who was to come. And so he sent some of his followers to Jesus and said, hey, Jesus, I just want to know, am I right about you? Are you actually the Messiah, or should I expect someone else? And Jesus' answer was this: go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, and on and on. See, these are the signs of the arrival of the Messiah. And it seems like when you look at those passages, it's pretty clear that this is something that's going to happen. And we oftentimes think that this was people receiving their sight was something that happened commonly in those days, or at least it was a common claim in Jesus' time. But actually, in all of Jewish literature, there is no other instance, not even a claim of someone who was born blind receiving their sight. Not a single one. You see lepers that are healed, lame people walking, but people who are blind from birth do not receive their sight. Okay? This is a unique situation. Okay? And the Pharisees knew this. But because Jesus didn't look at the law the way they looked at the law, then they willfully closed their eyes to what should have been obvious to them. The man, though, he had no such agenda. Because he could follow Jesus, and he could follow what his eyes told him. And while the Pharisees in the story become more and more defiant and more willfully blind, the man is able to see clearer and clearer and clearer. Well, when they're done with his parents, they summon the man again. And here you can start to see their frustration growing, and you can start to see him grow in confidence too. So tell us again, what exactly did he do to you? How did he heal you? Okay, and as this man's eyes are opening, he's starting to see through their act, right? And so he says, I already told you what happened, but you were not listening. And then he adds this sarcastic gem, okay? He says, do you want to be his disciples too? And this is something that really ticks them off, okay? Even the suggestion that they would be a disciple of Jesus starts to make them mad, and they start to hurl insults at him. We would never follow a rule breaker like that. We would never follow a sinner like that. We follow Moses. We don't have any idea where this man comes from. And this is great, okay? Because the man now, he starts to go on the offensive, right? They're starting to make fools of themselves. And he just feels really confident in where he is. Have you ever had the experience where someone who is reasonably well educated said something just absolutely ridiculous, right? That anyone that's older than 15 years old could tell it was absolutely ridiculous, or trying to cover up for a lie that everybody goes, come on, why don't you just give it up? Okay, this is the kind of thing that's happening right there. Okay, and this guy is responding this way. A lot of times you'll just go, when they say this ridiculous thing, you'll just go like something like this, interesting, right? You know what I'm talking about? He said, this is kind of how I see the guy responding to them. And I see he's got this little smirk on his face. And he says, they said, we don't even know where this man comes from. And he says, interesting. Now listen, he says, you don't know where he comes from. And yet, here I am. I was blind from birth, but here I am. Now I can see. And you don't know where he comes from, really. Seriously. And he goes on and he starts to give his theology, which isn't perfect, okay? He says, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing, okay? In other words, what he's saying is why is it so hard for you guys to see what's right in front of your face? Why is it so hard for you to see? I mean, I don't know if this guy is a sinner or not. Here's what I do know. Once I was blind, but right now I can see. See, the man was open to Jesus, and as a result, not only was he able to physically see, he could spiritually see. The Pharisees had spent their entire lives learning the law of Moses, and in fact, back in John chapter 5, Jesus has kind of this same conversation with them, where he's talking to them about the Scriptures, and this is what he says to them, chapter 5, verse 39. He says, you study the Scriptures diligently, because you think that in them you have eternal life. These are the very Scriptures that testify about me, yet you refuse to come to me to have life. See, they had memorized and practiced it one way for so long, their whole life, that everything that they knew about it had blinded them to what they were really looking for in Jesus. And in the end, they rejected what God did in the man's life and threw him out of the synagogue. Incredible, isn't it? Now, at the end of the story, Jesus heard that the Pharisees had thrown the man out of the synagogue, and so he went to find him. And he asked the man when he found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? And Jesus wasn't asking, do you believe in the theory of the Son of Man? Do you believe in the theology of the Son of Man? Okay, and Son of Man was another title for the Messiah. Okay, he wasn't asking, do you believe that the Messiah in general exists? He was asking, do you trust me? Do you trust the Son of Man? And I love the continued honesty of the man, because he's not doesn't give this theological tome. What he does, he says, all right, just tell me about him and I'll believe. And Jesus says, here I am. I'm the one. And in verse 38, this is where the man's sight was completely restored. He says, Lord, I believe. Now notice that progression again. We saw it happening. He went from calling him the man they called Jesus, even though he'd never seen him, to he is a prophet. And then we see that he notices that he's someone who's worth following as a disciple. And then he says he's a man sent by God. And then finally he is Lord. Okay, that's the process of spiritual sight, where you start out and you just go, I just don't know that much, but it takes this humility and it starts small. But once you start to encounter Jesus, then the sight starts to grow. Well, great story, isn't it? Great story. So what's the takeaway? Well, I think there are probably some people who would be tempted to believe that John is trying to make a general statement about the virtues of open-mindedness. And there's some truth to that. I think it's a good thing for us to be open-minded, to be open to the evidence and looking and seeing and not being so blinded by preconceived notions and all of that. But that's not really John's point. In fact, John's claim here, just like it is all throughout the book, is that Jesus is the light of the world that enables everyone to be able to see correctly. Okay? Now, I know that there are a lot of people who would like to look at Jesus as this open-ended, general, spiritual hippie guru or something like that, and he just wants us to believe in something. Right? And so that's why when we talk about faith, oftentimes it can become a meaningless word. Okay, I just have faith that it's all going to work out in the end or whatever. But that's not really what Jesus is saying. In fact, Jesus himself doesn't leave us with that option. He himself claims to be the dividing line between sight and blindness. And in fact, he says here in verse 39, he says, I entered this world to render judgment, to give sight to the blind, and to show those who think they can see that they are blind. Now, there are a couple of things in life that causes spiritual blindness. And I would call them religion and irreligion. Those are things that cause spiritual blindness. I mean, there are many people in our society who don't pay a whole lot of attention to Jesus. In fact, polls say that people are becoming increasingly less and less religious. And they say that they're spiritual or something like that, but are becoming less and less religious. In fact, there are some people who say, well, science has shown us that we don't really need God. Okay, that everything that we need to know about the world that we can learn through science. And you know me, you know that I don't have anything bad to say about science. Okay, science is a wonderful tool. It's going to fix my eyes in a couple of weeks. And our ability to be able to understand the world through science is actually an incredible gift. It allows us to be able to alleviate a huge amount of suffering in the world. But sometimes science can keep us so focused outwardly on the things that we can manipulate that it blinds us to our deeper spiritual hunger. And while we can make our world safer and more comfortable and actually raise our life expectancy, eventually all of us will die. It's not given us immortality, and it doesn't even tell us why we're here or what is our purpose for being here. And even with all of the technological advancements that we have, and in the more technologically advanced societies, things like suicide and depression and loneliness and lack of purpose continue to rise. And I think there's a direct result of that, is because we get so focused on those things that we can change and those things that we can manipulate that we forget about the purpose, the inner things that are happening in life. And looking at those things through that certain lens blinds us to the fact that we have a spiritual hunger that cannot be satiated by anything other than Jesus. So, of course, then there are some people who will say, well, then the answer then is religion, right? Then we should just become very religious. And but the story actually tells us something different, because actually the Pharisees are about as religious as they come, right? I mean, and it was precisely their religion, it was precisely their adherence to rules that blinded them to be able to see the work of God, the authentic work of God that was happening in this man. They were so concerned about their religious learning and their obsession with the proper rules that they forgot about the important things. They forgot that it was about people. See, it's really easy for us as Christians to be so focused on all of the trappings of religion, of all the things that we're supposed to be doing, going to church and reading the Bible and, doing this good work and things like that, that we forget about the heart of it, God's love for people. which is what the gospel is really about. And while Jesus did the religious things, he went to the temple and, he studied scripture and he did all of those things and he did good works, but he always did so in such a way that demonstrated God's love for people. He noticed people who were suffering and he recognized their dignity, and rather than blame sinners, he called them into relationship with him. And if our religion ever causes us to forget about people, or to treat them as other, then we're not following the religion of Jesus. And whether you're irreligious or overly religious, God wants to change our hearts and to give us new spiritual vision. And the spiritual vision doesn't cause us to separate ourselves from people or judge people or blame them, but it causes us to love them just the way Jesus did. That healing, though, only begins when we recognize our need for it. When we're able to say, like the man, I once was blind, but now I see. And the reason I can see is not because of my own effort. It's not because of my own learning. It's not because of all the good things that I've done. But it's because I have Jesus, who is the light of the world, who has enabled it. I don't know everything, but this I know. I once was blind, but now I see. That's the path to healing. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this story. We thank you for your word. And God, we thank you that you give us a new way to see, that you give us new lenses to be able to see the world. And I think probably everyone in this sanctuary today has seen the world through one of those two lenses of being irreligious, of not wanting to have anything to do with it, and maybe thinking that it's all just a myth and it's all made up and we don't need it because we're beyond that. And yet there are others who have tended at different points in our lives to blind ourselves to what Jesus taught us, what Jesus showed us about how we ought to be, how he created us to be. We've been blinded to that by our blind adherence to our religion and rule following and all of that. So God, I pray that as we go through these next few messages and we take a direct look at Jesus and we try to see him for who he is, not for who we want him to be and not who this or that told us about before. But Lord, that we would be able to see you with fresh eyes and to be able to see the world through your eyes. So Lord, thanks again for teaching us. And I pray that each of us would have the humility to learn and to grow and to change not just how we see, but how we live. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.